think we hit our critical mass to start. So, welcome to Public Health Approach to Regulating Natural Gas Infrastructure. We have 3 panelists for you. For an introduction, as natural gas infrastructure continues to pollute environments in the state, it's imperative to employ regulations that protect the health of all Marylanders. During this session, panelists will share existing gaps in the regulation of natural gas infrastructure, including the lack of safeguards for public health protection. Additionally, panelists will discuss recommendations for regulation improvements and strategies to better detect and monitor the toxic pollution through citizen science. A training session on FracTracker, an app to assist residents in creating real-time data on their experience of growing natural gas infrastructure, will be given. Maryland communities are utilizing this tool to monitor and track changes to their health as pipelines, compressor stations, and related infrastructure move closer to home. So I will introduce each panelist who will give a presentation, and at the end we'll have time for questions and answers. So our first panelist is Yinka Bode-George, Program Manager for the Maryland Environmental Health Network. She is an environmental public health advocate and is enthusiastic about creating health equity, environmental justice, and sustainable development through activism, policy, and practice. As a program manager for the Maryland Environmental Health Network, Yinka develops, implements, and promotes effective programmatic initiatives. She also promotes environmental health equity through legislative action. Yinka has worked in various capacities in support of programs that promote health outcomes and undo drivers of health inequities in Baltimore City. She is a graduate of Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, where she received her Master's of Health Science degree in Environmental Health. Take it away.
Oh, that was first.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, let me also introduce another panelist. After a career as a senior intelligence analyst at DIA, can you explain that?
Defense Intelligence Agency.
There we go. And senior budget examiner at
Office of Management Budget, Federal Office.
In 1999, Len started his own consulting business informing clients about the U.S. budget process. In 2004-2005, he became active in environmental matters affecting the Chesapeake Bay by joining the Calvert County Environmental Commission and the Board of the Patuxent Riverkeeper. In 2007, Len and his wife, Karen, organized the Southern Maryland Oyster Cultivation Society, an organization that planted 12 million spat on reefs it's restored on the Patuxent River. In 2014, Lee ran unsuccessfully for delegate to the General Assembly. During his campaign, he learned of Dominion Energy's request to build a $3.8 billion methane liquefaction facility at Coke Point, and became concerned when he learned that regulators indicated that this facility would emit 2 million tons of greenhouse gases and hundreds of tons of other hazardous and toxic pollutants right next to residential communities. In 2015, Len joined the board of the Calvert League of Women Voters. Because he had some knowledge about the Dominion facility, he agreed to do research on whether federal and state regulations protected nearby residents from toxic pollution. His research revealed that regulations would not. His presentation today will include lessons learned from Coke Point that will help other communities afflicted by natural gas infrastructure to be more effective in opposing these harmful facilities.
Thank you. The lesson I've learned today already is that I am more an analyst than a salesman. And as I look at other PowerPoint presentations with nicer colors, better graphics, and so forth, I know what I have to do in the future. But at this point, I just ask you to sit back, take a deep breath, and get ready for a deluge of information. The whole point of this presentation here today is to reach out to you and to work with you to try to find ways to find methods for opposing the pollution coming from various natural gas infrastructure facilities. We are here to find ways to protect ourselves from those threats. This is going to be a 3-part presentation. The first part is why regulators fail to protect Calvert residents. The second is the lessons that we in Calvert learned as a result of that. And the third is the steps that other NGI-affected communities can take to fight pollution. So I really want to give you a sense of why regulators fail to protect Calvert citizens and what other communities that have natural gas facilities nearby can do to fight that. So there are a number of points as to what happened and why regulators failed. Starting in 2012, Dominion submitted a request to put in a $3.8 billion liquefaction facility Does anybody not know what liquefaction is? By the way, this is such a small group. If I use a term you don't understand, stop me and I'll be glad to explain. Liquefaction is taking natural gas as a gas, that's methane primarily, condensing it, chilling it to make it more suitable for transportation. Reduces the size and volume by about 600. It's 1/600th as large. So that's what Dominion asked for. Regulators reviewed the Dominion facility. Yes?
Quick question about your description of liquefied natural gas. What's the difference between that and what I often hear is referred to as compressed natural gas?
I don't know what compressed gas is. That could just mean gas under higher pressure.
Okay.
But liquefied is much different, and it is what it says. It's a liquid rather than a gas.
And there are often compressor stations that compress the gas, and it's usually to get it into pipelines for transport.
And they can push more through at higher pressures. So when Dominion submitted this application, they had to go through regulators to get various permits. In the course of their review of the Dominion request, regulators identified that Dominion was going to emit 2 million tons of global warming gases. And then you can see here 432 tons of toxic chemicals, 300 tons of particulate matter, and 30 tons of volatile organic compounds. The Dominion officials knew exactly what they were doing, and they got to public officials early in the process. What do I mean by early in the process? When a company submits an application, they know they have to go through the regulators, and they start approaching them early on to convince them what we want to do is going to help you economically, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The people who live in the communities typically don't find out about these proposals until it's too late in the process to really affect them. When Calvert citizens did find out that Dominion was going to request this facility, they asked for two major studies, either an environmental impact statement or quantitative risk assessment. Suffice it to say that both of these studies are very detailed, very thorough in evaluating the health and safety risks of the facilities. What happened, though, is that federal and state officials who were not part of the regulators, in other words, state senators, state delegates, county commissioners, they were told by the regulators, don't worry, we've got these tests, we're going to be taking care of you, the public is going to be protected. But they relied on an environmental assessment, which is much smaller. An EIS, an environmental impact statement or quantitative risk assessment, would be a document about this big. The environmental assessment is about this big. And they give the appearance of a thorough review, but it's not anywhere near as thorough, and it's not subject to the same rigorous standards as others. So what happened, in my bio I indicated that I was on the board of the Calvert League of Women Voters. They asked me whether I was willing to do a study on whether the regulations actually did protect Calvert voters from pollution, and I did the study. And in fact, I've been doing that study for about 3.5 years. I'm just wrapping it up now, and my analysis found many gaps in the regulations. The biggest gap, and the thing that I've talked with other people about, we talked about in an earlier session, is that the regulators are only interested in monitoring and regulating the greenhouse gases. They have sensors throughout the state of Maryland that are determining the level, the density of greenhouse gases, and they're hurting their hands by patting themselves on the back, saying, we are keeping greenhouse gases down at levels that are acceptable. They're not reporting on pollution in the community right next to Cove Point, which is where we live. So while they're giving us assurances that a state park in Virginia, across the Potomac River, in fact across the Patuxent River and the Potomac River, has low pollution as a result of the Dominion facilities, they didn't say one word about the pollution in the community right next to Cove Point. The other thing is, as they look to various pollution measurements, they exempted a number of them from measurements. So they're not even trying to check them out because they don't fit into their criteria. The next big weakness in what the regulators did is they built their projections of what pollution levels. Remember earlier, an earlier slide, 2 million tons of greenhouse gases, 300 tons of other toxic materials, and so 432 tons of toxic materials, 300 tons of particulate matter, and 30 tons of volatile organic compounds. They built that up through a series of estimates. They got data from equipment manufacturers that Dominion was installing in their facility. They had standard methodologies in EPA for calculating pollution levels. They had, and this is the one that causes me the most pain, not the most pain, the most irritation. They had a promise from Dominion that we are going to be doing good management practices, good combustion practices that are going to keep pollution down. Now, unfortunately, the way they set up their documents, their regulations, was very misleading. And I'm going to jump ahead here because I said I didn't have a lot of graphics. This is the graphic, but this tells the whole story. The story is this. The way the regulations are written and the way Dominion has to report pollution is an average level of pollution measured in tons a year. This is that average. This is the line that shows that if you have hypothetical levels of pollution, this is a hypothetical graph. It's not an actual one, but it illustrates the point quite clearly. It shows that there are 1, 2, 3, 4 times a year when pollution levels are of concern. It's not a year, it's a much shorter time period, day of the month. But the real killer, the real kicker in this, is that this is the level that is toxic for chemicals. And it shows how high the pollution can go. And Dominion doesn't have to report anything except this average level of tonnage a year. As far as I'm concerned, that is the biggest problem, the biggest weakness of that. Yes?
I was just curious which toxic pollutants you're talking about here.
I'll be glad to show them to you. I have them listed. There are just too many. And for that matter, federal definitions of which are toxic and which aren't, it's pages and pages of them. And, but the point is, particularly about volatile organic compounds and these other toxic materials, they interact in the atmosphere with other molecules, form particulate matter, and particulate matter is the most dangerous, particularly below 2.5 microns, because that can be drawn more deeply into the lungs than normally would be the case, and that can subject cells to exposure to toxic, cancer-causing chemicals. So, I showed you that graph, and in some ways, these 3 points all feed into that. Number 1, they're not measuring pollution near the point source of pollution. Number 2, they're not showing peak emissions in their reporting to the federal regulators. They only have to show gross averages, and there are no, and this is the other part of it that's troubling. There is no need to notify people in the communities close to those facilities that they are being subjected to higher levels of pollution than are safe. The other thing that is easy to understand, and I won't even belabor it, they're letting Dominion do a lot of its own reporting. Dominion is interested in making a profit. If it reports that it has a higher level of pollution than allowed, and it reports to the feds, they have to curtail operations or do something to correct it. They're going to be as flexible as possible, and I use that with quotation marks. The other thing, do you remember earlier I mentioned what the regulators did by way of calculating the projected pollution levels? When it came time to address the question of how much pollution is Dominion actually going to be emitting, they said, don't do a physical measurement of that pollution. Use the same methodology, essentially, that we used in projecting levels. It doesn't take a genius to see that if their methodology is flawed at the beginning, they are not going to get an accurate measure of pollution. So, we've already talked about that. Now, why did Dominion leave these gaps in the regulations? I looked up the regulations or the mission assignment for, the mission statement for the Environmental Protection Agency. And basically, the reason that they didn't measure it is that legislators, both federal and state, do not require measurement of toxic levels. They've decided that greenhouse gases are a danger, so they're measuring that, but not toxic materials. So that is one of the problems that we're facing. Now, what does this mean for the residents of Cove Point? The problem for the residents of Cove Point is we don't get, now we live about 3.5 miles away from Cove Point, but I still consider myself nearby. We don't get reports when Dominion has one of those, remember that really high peak of pollution? That is the most dangerous form of pollution. We don't get reports on that. And the bottom line is this message, that even if Dominion were to observe all the regulations for reporting pollution as written, they would not have to report to the people of Calvert County, more specifically near their facility, when they have higher levels of toxic pollution than authorized. So, what are the lessons learned for other communities that may be subjected to toxic pollution? Number one, we learned about the details of that facility too late to affect public officials. Number two, we accepted regulators' word that regulations were effective in reporting on pollution, but then nobody told us they were only talking about greenhouse gases, not toxic pollution. I don't know whether any of you were present in an earlier presentation where Dr. Anna Rule spoke and two other people spoke. What Dominion did was got Calvert officials to sign a non-disclosure agreement. They're not even going to be paid $130,000 apiece for that non-disclosure agreement. But that meant that they did not tell the residents of Calvert County the details of the program. And frankly, the most offensive part of that is a local public official gave away $500 million. That's B, as in billion, to Dominion as a tax incentive when absolutely none was needed. And they didn't tell people until after the deal was cut, and we went from there. So,
what was the non-disclosure about? Do you have any idea?
Everything. Dominion said that the whole negotiation for the fees, the agreement that they had to get the pay taxes, and Calvert agreed to reduce it 42%. Safety. The Calvert commissioners didn't tell us anything about what was going to happen, what were the plans for a safe evacuation. It was what? Pardon?
Even FOIAs?
We didn't know to ask a FOIA.
But the non-disclosure agreement even included those, like if somebody requests information, you have to deny it. It's ridiculous. It's incredible. Yeah.
They declared that this was proprietary information that could affect their profits, and therefore they didn't have to tell anybody anything until after the fact. So, Dominion?
Okay, so how could they do a non-disclosure if there has to be what's called tier 2 reporting?
Well, you're getting technical now.
Okay.
All I know is that that is what they did, and they resisted requests from us for information.
Right, that's, tier 2 reporting is a requirement. It's it falls under the Community Right to Know Act, okay? And so in the event that there is an event like this, certain aspects that are proprietary to a company are excluded from Public Information Act release. However, they still have to give that information to the Maryland Department of the Environment, who then notifies the county where, the area where it's located, so that that area can respond appropriately with whatever. So I'm just saying
You're asking a very good statement, and you're making a very good case. Unfortunately, the facts of the matter didn't prove themselves out to enable us to do that. We didn't even know to file that action. So
yeah.
Local officials didn't carry their responsibility, state officials didn't, regulatory officials didn't.
So I would propose that, I'm just saying this because I've only just learned about some of these as
Yeah,
well.
I know, but I've got to move on with my presentation. I'll be happy to get additional details from you for the simple reason that I had just found out. that Dominion is going to be trying to install a second liquefaction train there at Cove Point, and we're going to need all the regulatory information we can to try to stop that. Another reason why we Calvert citizens weren't able to oppose Dominion and what they wanted to do is Dominion made a big point of how its facility was unique. The processes that they're using in liquefaction were not duplicated in any other liquefaction facility. And therefore, Calvert residents didn't have a measure to sit back and say, well, gee, you're going to have this kind of a generator, it's going to produce this and that. We just didn't have that. And also at the meeting, at the last meeting before lunch, the point was made, Dominion submitted a report and said we have 15,000 components that are leak susceptible for volatile organic compounds. Just before they were really ready to begin production, they said, oh, sorry, just kidding. We actually have 168,000 components. And our volatile organic compound emission leaks are going to jump from 2.53 tons to 20.2 tons. And oh, by the way, please ignore that because we think it's too hard to measure, and so you should give us some forgiveness on that. And they did. So, yeah. So, the other thing, and here's where I get into some things that some people may disagree with. We in Calvert County were distracted because initially the community was very upset about Dominion. But the organization that came in to help us fight Dominion instead tried to enlist us to fight fracking. Now that's a legitimate connection, but it's not a legitimate public relations tactic. Why? Because I had a lot of people argue with me that we're not going to be doing fracking in Calvert County, which is in the southern part of Maryland. The fracking is going to be done in Allegheny County and Garrett County, which is in northwest Maryland. And it distracted people, people drifted away. You have to keep focus on things. So, what can communities that are going to be afflicted by natural gas infrastructure do? Number one, find out as early as possible about the characteristics of the proposed facility. Two, learn the kinds and amounts of projected toxic emissions and the health threats they create. Determine whether, and this is important, start early on and determine whether the regulators are going to be measuring the pollution levels or whether Dominion is going to be measuring pollution levels. This is really important. Make every effort to engage regulators and public officials before permits are issued. Why do I put that in bold letters, capital letters? Because if you think about it, public officials and regulators are human like all of us. We don't like to admit that we made a mistake, particularly if it's going to embarrass us professionally. To have to change something after they have approved it is really embarrassing, which is why you have to get to your political efforts and your organizing efforts and everything before the facilities are approved. Analyze the laws and regulations, like the very point you brought up. I am interested in getting the details of what you were referring to. Find out what's relevant. It's too bad that Kelly Canavan isn't here. Kelly has worked with a team of lawyers. They have fought Dominion to a standstill in Charles County with a proposed compressor station. They're doing a superb job of that. Determine what information. This is the sort of thing that I learned that was reinforced in a group discussion. Find out what is important to the community. And I would argue it's health. Tell people, tell mothers, tell fathers, tell grandparents that the facility is going to raise questions, present threats to people's health, and that is what you have to do. Find like-minded organizations. I think that there is a movement afoot in Maryland of a lot of organizations. It's not just the Me Too movement, where more women are running for office. I think more people are energized about pollution, and focus on core issues like health threats, not other topics like fracking. Who's going to pay for the wall that's going to be erected along our southern border?
We are.
Who's going to be paying for the wall along the southern border? Donald Trump raised to an art form that, see, you all must not be loyal Americans because you didn't say Mexico. But my point here is that he focused on one thing and he emphasized that. so that when we're talking about what we want to do, the first thing we say, the middle thing we say, and the last thing we should say is, we're working to protect your health. And that is the message that we should be emphasizing again and again and again. So, gather information from reliable sources. I'm not saying this just because Sam is here, but FracTracker has valuable information that will put a proposed new national gas infrastructure facility in perspective. Community of communities. How many of you heard of and know about community of communities? Look us up on the internet. It is a group of people who have similar experiences with natural gas infrastructure. They want to fight it. Internet research. I found the internet incredibly valuable in the research I did on my paper, and citizen science. Use every medium to spread the word. I'm not going to lecture you all. I'm not on Facebook or Twitter or any of these other things. You could teach me lots of things, but use them, whatever is out there. And finally, learn effect. You know, what I hear often from communities that are first facing a threat from a proposal to put in natural gas infrastructure is, we don't know what to do. Partner with somebody who does know what to do, who is doing something. Kelly Callahan with Amp Creek Council is doing a terrific job. And organized large group, that's an obvious one. The final point, I think it is close to the final point I want to make, is that while fear can motivate people to do something to fight a program, you're going to be more successful in persuading public officials if you bring out facts, and if you show them what the law is, and what the zoning regulations are, and so forth. This isn't my opinion. There's a wonderful woman, Lisa Graves Marcucci, who works for the Environmental Integrity Project. She's been extremely effective in Southwest Pennsylvania in fighting natural gas industries. This is a point that she made several times in the presentation she gave us. You have to be factual, you have to be non-hostile, and when you are that way, public officials are more likely to listen to you. And I think that that's, key goals. This is the final slide. Key goals. Number one, we should be looking for regulations that will give us information on requests for NGI facilities at the very beginning. Number two, request citizen-based 24/7 fence line monitoring of toxic pollution in neighborhoods, and insist on a permit review process that includes either an environmental impact statement, a quantitative risk assessment, or a health impact assessment that will identify threats before the final approval is made. This has to be done before the final approval. So I've run over my time, I know. I'll leave it up to Yinka as to how you want to handle it with the other speakers.
If we could hold the questions till the end, that would be great. And I'm so excited to introduce you because I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Irena Gorski. I'm a doctoral student at Hopkins, and I will be focusing my research on the health impacts of fracking. And so they invited me. But to remind you of who Yinka is, she's awesome, and I already read her bio, but she is currently the program manager for the Maryland Environmental Health Network.
Okay, so I'm really happy to be here. Thank you, Len, for your talk. I think that really set up what we're here for today. So just to give a little bit of the framing of this panel, Len really gave a really great overview of the regulation gaps. And I'm going to follow up with that with the talk about citizen science as a way to fill in those sort of gaps through a lens of public health protections, as he was echoing. And then we're going to move into some actual citizen science strategies. So, hello everyone. And so today I'm going to be talking about citizen science, what it is, why Maryland needs it, and the barriers to using citizen science to promote public health protections. So just to give a little bit of background of what the Maryland Environmental Health Network is. Our mission is to eliminate environmental threats to human health. We are a women of color-led organization, and I think that's a very important facet of what we do, how we do it, and contributing to the workforce in this way. We're based in Baltimore, but we work across the state of Maryland, and we're a network of health professionals, environment and health advocates, and impacted community members. And we operate as community builders, educators, and environmental health policy experts. So this is actually the lens we use when we look at all environment and health issues. Equity, access, and justice, so equity in the distribution of benefits and burdens among all Marylanders, access to decision makers at a time when their actions can inform a process rather than provide observations on the impact of an action, and then justice being the realization of highest potential of each and all without the weight of structural barriers or biases. So what is citizen science? So this is a quote from the EPA. Citizen science covers a suite of innovative tools to engage with the public, to apply their curiosity and contribute their talents to science and technology. Citizen scientists can provide information that would not otherwise be available due to time, geographic, or resource constraints. So it's So we know citizen science as things like community science, community-based monitoring, popular epidemiology for those of us in that space, and then participatory sciences. It has a lot of other names attached to it, but it's basically, in a broad sense, scientific democracy. So the inclusion of diverse set of stakeholders in the scientific process. And it can be used for educational initiatives, research, or regulatory enforcement, as Len was speaking to. How is it done? So through partnership. Partnership through research institutions and communities is the key to getting citizen scientists. And institutions can provide the technical expertise, tools, and other resources to support community and community members. So a part of citizen science projects includes quality assurance project plans, and it really is relying on the type of project you want to employ, but it's basically a project plan that follows EPA guidelines for environmental data collection. And it helps provide the credibility to the data. It's not always required. For example, if you're doing a more educational initiative, you may not need like a full fleshed out project plan. So why is it important? It actively engages the public. When you have community members who are engaged in the data collection process, it creates the sort of learning and empowerment that's really important for community stakeholders. It builds an informed public. So the report back of the data collection helps inform community members, and then when communities are better able to identify issues, they can then be empowered to take action to protect their health. It fills in the gaps between public policy and scientists that typically exist, and the power dynamics that make that, the asymmetry exist. So it also creates healthier communities and people being able to advocate for themselves. So some projects for citizen science initiatives can include air monitoring, photography projects, observing and recording environmental concerns, and also monitoring water quality. So why does Maryland need citizen science? I'm going to use air pollution as a sort of case study for this issue. When you think about fugitive air emissions, which are for polluting facilities, these are the air emissions that are not necessarily recorded. They're fugitive, they escape. They're still hazard concerns, but they're not necessarily monitored. So yes, undetected leaks from refineries, natural gas pipelines, energy production sites, etc. So ambient air monitors offers inaccurate pollution rates. As Len mentioned before, if your facility is in close proximity to you, though your air monitoring site is really far away, it's not going to capture your direct exposure to pollution. So yeah, there are 24 air monitoring sites in Maryland, and that's frankly not enough to capture all the localized exposures. So communities most directly impacted by pollution, they deserve to know what they're being exposed to, and as Len stated, when they're being exposed. So regulatory agencies need to understand in accuracy what residents are being exposed to, and frankly, the current air monitoring sites aren't enough to give that information. So this brings us to fence line air monitoring. And these are the air monitoring technologies that are able to detect the fugitive emission rates being placed in areas that are closer to the sites to give the point source monitoring of pollution. And it allows for the disaggregation of the data. Len was speaking to, if you look at Maryland as a whole state as opposed to people who have direct exposure, you're going to miss a lot of things. So citizen science data can reveal environmental health concerns that the conventional monitoring cannot be able to, and it can better inform strategies for addressing solutions to those concerns. So some barriers, current barriers, there is no legitimate legal backing for citizen science data. So upholding the collected data in the court of law is not possible at this time. Also, in a sort of underseen aspect of this is the community buy-in. So for some people who have experiences and who seek out fence line monitoring, for example, this is a really relevant thing to them. But for some communities who may have distrust, who may have poor experiences with academic institutions, for example, working with them could be a very difficult process. And then as well, support from regulatory agencies can also act as a barrier. To address these barriers, it's really important to, one, gain the support from the regulatory agencies through things like technologies, resources, and allowing them to put the credibility behind this data source. Also, legal backing is an important initiative to pursue to, again, put the credibility behind the data. As well, more partnerships with communities and academic institutions to generate citizen scientists. So if you have better community engagement, better pipelines to create the leaders to go out and then train other people to be citizen scientists, we can create a more robust workforce. And again, community engagement is super important when you think about those communities who may not be as open to these initiatives. And I'll just end there. This is just some information about my organization for your review. And I look forward to our discussion afterwards.
Okay, thanks, Yinka. And now moving forward from an overview of citizen science to a specific example, we have Dr. Samantha Rubright. She is a communications manager with 12 years of experience working on controversial energy, public health, and environmental issues. She's currently the manager of communications and partnerships for FracTracker Alliance, a nonprofit whose mission is to study, map, and communicate the risks of oil and gas development to protect the planet and support the renewable energy transformation. With FracTracker, she conducts and translates environmental health research for the website, nurtures collaborative relationships, manages FracTracker's student internship program, and serves as the primary contact for media inquiries. Certified in public health, Dr. Rubright obtained a master's of public health degree in 2010 from the University of Pittsburgh Graduate School of Public Health's Behavioral and Community Health Sciences Department, and more recently in 2016, her Doctor of Public Health degree from Pitt Public Health's Environmental and Occupational Health Department, focusing on the effects of exposure to cyanide and hydrogen sulfide. Additionally, she has explored and advised on the impacts of extractive industries on communities and public health in Africa and Europe.
Okay, so that wasn't a mouthful. Sorry, I didn't realize we'd be reading them out loud.
Surprise!
Surprise! So how many people in here have actually heard of the organization FracTracker? Okay, not bad. So we got started at the University of Pittsburgh Graduate School of Public Health when I was a grad student there. And essentially, we were getting phone calls from concerned community members as a point of contact. They had environmental health concerns about fracking, and as researchers, we said, "What's that?" This was in 2009. We were getting these phone calls, and as researchers, we had no good data to go off of. The state at the time, Pennsylvania, was not releasing the location of the oil and gas wells. Actually, Maryland's pretty bad about that. But Pennsylvania at the time had a really big influx of drilling, and they weren't releasing any maps of where the drilling activity was, where they were issuing violations to the operators. And at this point, drilling hadn't taken off to the degree that we see now. Pennsylvania now has over 10,000 unconventional wells drilled since 2006, essentially. And most of those occurred in 2011, 2012. And so FracTracker got started as a way to track that data. We were doing it manually at first, and then finally, by working with the state, we encouraged them to start releasing data, actually geolocated data on where these wells were being drilled, where they were issuing violations, even in some cases, air emission data, although that's pretty limited in some respects. So we are now no longer with the university. We converted into a nonprofit in 2010, and that's when I left working for the university and started working directly for FracTracker. And our main goal is to help people engage with this data. And we want to be a resource for you, for anybody who's doing a campaign around a compressor station, around any of these facilities that Len was talking about. We want to be a resource for you. And so today I'm going to be talking specifically about one of our tools that we have. We have a lot of different resources on our website. I would encourage you to go visit. We have a lot of free photos that you can use if you're doing a presentation, as long as you just acknowledge the photographer and FracTracker, you can use them in your presentations. That really helps a lot of people to visualize what you're talking about. And they're all grouped by theme, so if you're talking about pipelines, we've got a bunch of pipeline photos, and they're also grouped by location if you're specific to certain areas. And also, if you have photos that you'd like to contribute, we would welcome those as long as you don't mind other people using them. But yeah, we've been involved in a lot of different projects, community-based research, but definitely as a resource for advocates and public health people who are concerned about what's going on in their communities. And a few years ago, we developed FracTracker, which is essentially the same thing as our website, but it is now available on our mobile app in a much more consolidated form. And I will just talk about some of the features. They're all listed here, but there is a map of all oil and gas wells that we have data on in the entire United States. These are active wells. As far as we can tell, if we have data on that. If they're old wells, we don't list them, just because we would be inundated. You wouldn't be able to see the ground. But this is in Colorado. These are all wells. These yellow lines, this is an old screenshot, but these yellow lines are pipelines, and these are user reports. And what happens is, you as a user of the app can go out, take a photograph of something that you see going on. So maybe it's just a pipeline under construction and you just want to document it. It doesn't have to be that there's anything wrong, but it can be. So some of these reports are people saying, well, I smelled something just really off downwind of this compressor station. Or I actually witnessed a spill, and here's the documentation. You can actually go in and click on them, you can see the photographs. So there's that, the map itself, and then there's also now an activity feed. And all of the different features are at the bottom. So there's an activity feed, the map, submitting a report, and then you also have a profile. And so the feed is very similar if you've ever used Instagram. You can see who submitted the feed. So Kirk was originally with our organization. He's now a researcher in New Mexico. But he submitted this report of a new well being built, took a photo. And you can also designate it based on the type of industry. Right now, these are the industries that we have kind of categorized. If there are ones that people say they start putting in a whole bunch of others continuously over time, we'll change these features to represent what the reports are. But right now, it's wells, pipelines, oil trains, compressors, refineries, trucks, pits, like the waste pits, landfills for solid waste, oil and gas, and mines. And those are mostly like frac sand mines. If you've ever visited parts of Wisconsin, the photos from those are just unbelievable. And so essentially going through the report, you click on the center button, you say what industry you're reporting on. If you know, sometimes it's really difficult to know what aspect that it is you're looking at. If there are any senses impacted, so this is helpful for reporting health concerns. So say you smell something that just seems wrong. If it's a real blunder to the eye, like It just looks terrible. Open pit frac sand mining, for example. I don't know who's going to be reporting on taste, but hey, I don't recommend food tasting anything.
But like water maybe?
Maybe it could be,
Water.
yeah, maybe your water, your own individual water, not their.
No. But I know in Pennsylvania they had some issues, right, initially with.
Yes. So
Catching
Pennsylvania.
on fire,
Yeah. Well, okay, so that's a little complicated. What you're talking about is there was methane leakage from some of these old wells and new wells. They were kind of they were interacting with each other. So the pressure that was going into drilling a frac well in one area, if it wasn't sealed properly, or if there was some sort of natural fault, what happened was that pressure would push into the old oil and gas well, and that one was not plugged or taken care of properly at all. And so what that would do is then it would sort of send out all of this pressure, and mostly it was natural gas, but there were also some other compounds that went with it that were problematic. But what that did is that forced methane into people's private drinking water because their drinking water wells weren't properly cased because they're old. And so that would essentially make it so that if you turned on your tap and water didn't come out, you could actually light your tap water on fire. Pennsylvania has a really old history with oil and gas, and I think it's essentially now Swiss cheese. Like the ground is not, it's not really conducive for all of this drilling, and so that's, I think, where some of the problems have come in. But yes, drinking water reports have been certainly reported throughout Pennsylvania and other parts of the country as well. And then also with these reports, you can upload or you can take a photo from the app itself. So that's either, go back and skip, yeah. So you upload an image if you have one. It's really helpful for people in the reporting process to include a photo. They're not always really telling or problematic, and that's okay. I think documenting when something looks right is just as important when something looks wrong, so you have something to compare it to. And then you're required to add a location. And this is, I mean, we're mapping people. We like knowing where the reports are located. And so what it'll do is you click on the location, it'll zoom into where you're standing at the time that you submit your report. And if it's not where you took the photo, you just drag it and you mark exactly on the map where you took the photo. I mean, there was one day I was a passenger in a car and I'm taking a photo. There was some really bad sedimentation in a waterway near my hometown from a pipeline that was being constructed just upstream. So I'm like in the car taking a photo, and we're moving, so I had to move the map to base on where I actually took the photo. So that's one of the features. And then as you submit these reports, you can look in your profile. So essentially when you log into the app, it's just going to ask you for a public name that other people are going to see. If you want to associate with an organization, you can. And then you'll see all of your reports. You can save them if you're not quite ready to submit them officially, and you go back and do that later. That's also really helpful. So this is one of the case studies that I was going to talk about, but I also want to mention one other one of how people are using this app. As I mentioned, we have Swiss cheese in Pennsylvania for our old oil and gas wells. So I don't know if you can see, but this is an old oil and gas well that was plugged with wood. So you can imagine over time what happens to wood. So this is essentially what is considered either an unplugged well. This one looks actually like it might be unplugged completely. And it's leaking whatever was in that well in the first place now into the atmosphere. Pennsylvania has over 100,000 oil and gas wells, and many of them, they don't know where those wells were drilled because it was prior to really good record keeping. And so this organization, Save Our Streams PA, is taking our app and taking photos when they find these wells, and so that we can then report to our regulatory agency where these are located. So it's just one of the campaigns that they're using to help identify these unplugged and abandoned wells. Another one that we're doing, and this is sort of a really interesting one that just came out. In January 2018, there was a pipeline proposal put forth in southwestern PA for what's called the Falcon Pipeline. And this is really helpful because you can kind of see how the app can be used for incoming infrastructure, not just existing infrastructure. This pipeline is going to feed the Shell ethane cracker that is being built in southwestern PA. And the ethane is essentially the preliminary product before ethylene. Ethylene then gets used in plastics production. So not only do we have oil and gas, but we have the plastics industry working within this realm. So you can imagine how much they like our project. And so what we did was we actually, prior to the release of this pipeline proposal, we were looking for whether there was any data on where this pipeline was going to be built. So we typed in Google Falcon data, and the second search item that came out was an unprotected GIS server for the contractor of that pipeline. So we downloaded it. FracTracker, there you go. So it took us over a year to go through this proposal information. So this was before they sent it to any regulatory agency. This was how they were doing their plans for identifying bat roosting areas and where to not drill through different wetlands. And it was pretty extensive. Shell actually did a lot of really extensive research, but there were also a lot of gaps that we identified during the process. One of these was actually a housing development decided they were going to sell their part of their property so that Shell could put the pipeline through. But they didn't tell the people who were buying homes to be built in that development. And there are no restrictions of building next to existing pipelines, just for putting in the new pipeline next to existing homes. And so a lot of these people were not informed of the fact that they just built, they're buying a home that's going to be within 660 feet of an ethane pipeline. One of the reasons that this pipeline didn't get as much attention as it probably deserved at the regulatory level is that it's an ethane pipeline, not a natural gas pipeline, and those are not subject to Federal Energy Regulatory Commission or FERC reviews or environmental impact statements like what Glenn was talking about. And so really we only could rely on what Shell was saying about the Falcon pipeline's potential impacts. And so that's why for us and for the community members in that region, it was extremely important to have access to that data early on and to be able to then take this. So we've had community reports now go in and say, oh, the Falcon pipeline is going to go through here. This is a school playground, or at least it's close to a school playground. Or there's a watershed here that wasn't identified within their original reporting. And so this has been extremely helpful for people, even though the pipeline hasn't been built yet. We know exactly where this pipeline is going. They can go in and say what's at risk. And one of the other final things that I'll talk about is just two things. One, we know that some of the regulatory agencies are looking at these reports, and it helps them when they're conducting inspections of well sites, because then they know kind of what to be concerned about, or what at least the concerns are of nearby community members. So that we know that just from personal correspondence with some of these agencies. Another interesting thing that's coming soon, you won't have to be on your mobile phone. You'll be able to access this map on a desktop. Hopefully this will be done by the end of the summer this year. And there's also a Spanish version of the mobile app that's being beta tested by some of communities in LA, by Stand LA. I don't know if anybody's familiar with them, but they've been awesome partners helping us beta test it. But yes, that's sort of some of the tools that we have available, but I'm ready, we can start kind of paneling questions if you want.
Okay, we have time for 2 or 3 questions.
This is for people have been mentioning, sorry, I didn't get it out. Fugitive air emissions.
Right.
I'm assuming Cove Point is near Busby.
Correct.
About 40 miles away from there is the Morgantown plant. Is that community affected by any emissions from that plant?
Probably not. Well,
Probably yes.
to a much lesser degree.
Yes,
It's-
probably yes. But it depends wind direction. It depends on the intensity of the emission. But Unfortunately, we don't have any data. There is no monitoring in the region.
There's a rough rule of thumb that the further away from a facility, the less dense the pollution is, but it's still there. And
I was just wondering if there could potentially be any like crossover of the particulates you find from your natural gas facility there with the stuff that's coming from Morgantown.
yes, cumulatively, if I understand your question correctly, cumulatively, whatever we produce that reaches Morgantown is added to what is already there in Morgantown. So that really makes it worse.
I actually had a question for Sam. Do you have any knowledge or any information if this is done anywhere else in the world? Because fracking is going on.
You mean the mapping
Is
aspect?
there something similar to to this type of mapping anywhere else? Do you know?
There are definitely different groups that have done mapping for specific projects. So trying to understand a pipeline or trying to understand, there are actually some maps in the UK, a lot of community groups that are concerned about drilling that could be coming there. They've been mapping those, but it's not on the same scale. We try to be a resource for people who, if they're concerned about a specific issue, we'll help them map it. And so we have really detailed maps about certain things, but we also have maps for all of the oil and gas wells in the U.S., most of the pipelines, including some distribution pipelines, but we don't have all of them. So one of the things that's really important for us is partnering with those groups and saying, hey, if you can share some data, we can share some data, so that we're both, because we're all working toward the same goal anyway. And it seems to be a really, I'd say, collaborative process so far. But yeah, not that I know of, at least not on the scale that we've been working.
Any other takers? Time for one more.
A question for you guys. Do you have some examples of how you're incorporating community science in the work that you're doing? Or is it just getting off the ground?
Through my organization.
Yeah.
Well, we encourage folks to use this particular map because it does exactly what we want to do. And actually we had an intern this past semester work on educational initiatives she went to different communities and gave an overview of FracTracker so that people can start to adopt it as their go-to method when recording natural gas related infrastructure or any other sort of exposure just getting laid out. So that's a really direct one that we use. So yeah, we're also really big advocates for the fence line monitoring, and that's going to be a long-term sort of project because we're really trying to get the regulators on board with that.
All right, well, thank you to the panelists. Thank you all for your good questions.
And I was going to say, if you have feedback about the app, we are not a large organization by any stretch of the imagination, so we would love to hear, what's working, what doesn't. We actually just worked with some people who knew nothing about oil and gas. We just wanted to see how they would interact with the app, and yeah, we have some work to do. So we would love to hear your input as well. If there are features you want added, we're definitely working to make sure that that's helpful.
Yeah, as part of the app, you also provide like the photo examples of this is what a pipeline something looks like so that people can kind of compare.
We don't. That's a good point. No, we don't. But I can show you kind of the one resource. So we don't right now. That's a really good point to be doing. But if you go on our website,
So many photos.
yeah, there's a lot of
I was
photos.
going to say, I gave a presentation this morning and I gave full description and they have an amazing reservoir and they're really nicely organized by theme. So I was interested in air pollution photos. I could just click on one of those big topics.
So yeah, I would say like these are a good start. They're not.
Because I think you can find it somewhere.
Yeah, so like if you go into pipelines, this is actually in Maryland. And thank you, I organize this.
They're very nice.
Thank you. So yeah, if you go in, we have all the pipeline photos tagged. So you can see some from the sky, you can see them from the ground, and there are different size ones. This is that one. This is a pipeline spill. That's why it was tagged that. This one's in the Netherlands, and they actually have a lot better process. They had an issue where there was one leak from this pipeline, maybe about a mile away. They shut down the whole system for a month till they fixed all the problems and looked upstream to make sure there weren't any other additional issues. It's amazing.
Can I ask a quick question? Just because something I saw on this page. What is flaring up in that picture? And why is it?
Oh, flaring?
Yeah.
So flaring is a process that the oil and gas companies try not to do it unless it's absolutely necessary, at least according to their reports. Flaring is when you're drilling for natural gas and you either get too much come out, and so they have to release the pressure. Now, releasing the pressure means intentionally emitting the natural gas into the atmosphere, but it's actually worse to release pure methane. So what they'll do is they'll burn it. So that is burning methane and other hydrocarbons. Now, these photos are actually taken, so this one says hydrogen sulfide gas, so there's probably also hydrogen sulfide being burnt or being emitted from that flare because the drilling in this region had the methane also has hydrogen sulfide that's part of the captured gas. But then in certain parts of North Dakota, where they're drilling primarily for oil. So oil and natural gas tend to develop in the geologic formations around the same areas. In North Dakota, there was mostly oil, but the problem is because of that, they didn't have the infrastructure to capture natural gas. So they were burning all of the natural gas that was coming out. They were wasting it. And so that is still occurring to some degree, but probably not to the same level as it was previously.
There's another example of flaring and where it's used in a liquefaction facility where when they want to reduce pressure in a pipeline that has some methane in it, they will flare it off and burn it so that they can empty that line and do whatever they need to go away maintenance. And when a ship comes in to be loaded with liquefied natural gas, if it has not already been chilled down to the proper temperature to avoid thermal shock to the components, and natural gas exists at a temperature of minus 260 degrees Fahrenheit, so it's very cold. They will pump some methane into these tanks as part of the chilling process and then burn that off.
Yes, this is also a processing facility in West Virginia. It's gotten a lot bigger since we last visited it, but you can see a flare there. And sometimes it's also used to test the natural gas, the pressure, what's going on as well.
But that's going into the air.
Yeah.
Like, in your community, if they were to do that, that's going into, there's people looking at that.
And that doesn't even talk about blowdowns.
Right.
Or shutdowns or startups.
I should probably show you some, there's
Normal.
some frac sand photos in here that are really,
Oh yeah, I agree with that, that's kind of crazy.
And I think an important thing about flaring is it's where your attention is drawn into it. There's many other parts and junctions along the system that are venting and you just don't see them. You see the flares because that's what's being burned, but there's other places that you don't see, but they're actually also. So it's actually good for the community to see the flares because at least you know that's a point.
Which was David's question.
Yeah.
it can also scare people too if they aren't like ready for it. There was a community near Pittsburgh that one of the wells had to be flared. About 3,000 people called 911 all at once. And so that also inundates your 911 system if you aren't doing, preparing community members for that kind of activity. And this is a frac sand mine from the sky. So, yeah. And actually one of the interesting things about the frac sand is we're seeing that they're having to use more and more as the wells become less productive. So, and the same goes for fresh water. Over time, originally we were seeing the average of 5 million gallons per well in parts of Pennsylvania and Ohio. There are some wells now that are 10 million gallons of water, and the same portion of frac sand has to go into that because they're hitting a point where the wells are sort of toward the edge of the really sweet spots, and when you're less productive, you have to add more to get stuff out. And so frac sand mining is increasing as is the water use. Okay. Well, hopefully these are helpful, and yeah, I look forward to hearing from you.